2023 was an interesting year in our housing markets, which defied all the negative media, the low consumer confidence, and the predictions of property Armageddon. In today's Property Insider chat, Dr. Andrew Wilson and I discuss some of the latest data to finish off the year, including the booming migration figures. We're back to the sort of boom of migration that we experienced in the 1950s. What does this mean for our housing markets? What's happening with employment, the economy, and how did our auction markets finish off? That's all going to be covered. So if you want to keep up to date with our regular Property Insider chats so that you know what's happening in our economy and our housing markets, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and click the little bell icon so we can let you know each time a new show comes out. 2023 was a year of change, a year of uncertainty for our property markets. But despite the stories of doom and gloom delivered by the media and the general negative consumer sentiment, our housing markets managed to defy the expectations of many of the commentators. And rather than receding, property values grew for 11 consecutive months around Australia. And rather than falling into recession, our economy confounded the Reserve Bank by bounding along as jobs kept being created and unemployment hovered near record lows. Of course, a lot of this had to do with our booming population growth. Australia's population rocketed back to boom time rates. In fact, the sort of rates we haven't seen of population growth since the mid-1950s. The latest statistics just out by the Australian Bureau of Statistics suggested our population increased by 2.4% in the month to June. A record 500,000 plus net influx of foreign students, workers and permanent settlers came to these shores, and net overseas migration added over 500,000 people, an increase of more than 150% over the previous year. Now, each week, Dr. Andrew Wilson and I have been sharing our thoughts on the latest property and economic news. And in today's Property Insider chat, I look forward to hearing his thoughts on some of this more recent data. Hi, Andrew.
Yeah, good day, Michael. And it has been a very big year. And I look forward to our final presentation for the year, when it will be the year that was. And certainly we'll be validating a lot of those positive results this year that, as you said, clearly confounded the so-called experts' early year predictions, which went right off the rails.
Well, recent data has shown that our economy is still strong. Now, I know people are hurting. The cost of living has gone up, petrol has gone up, mortgages or rents have gone up. And so they wonder when each week we say, Andrew, the economy's bounding along. So what data do you look at when you talk about a booming or a strong economy?
Well, I for one think it still is a booming economy. We haven't seen numbers like this really ever. And this is the modern economy now. It's different to when we did previously see 3% unemployment rates, which was the early 70s. And it's a different economy, it's a different world, different society. And to be having such consistency in terms of these 3% unemployment rates, which is what we've had basically all year, just really reflects how strong the economy is. And I guess at the end of the day, yes, inflation is high and it is tough to meet the family budget, I guess, for many. But at least the opportunities are there to earn income. And that's what we've been seeing. And incomes are now, not surprisingly, growing at record prices, although we must point out that real incomes are continuing to fall, which isn't good news. But the latest unemployment data, Michael, which was for, of course, November, we saw that the unemployment rate actually rose to its highest point in some time, 3.9%, certainly the highest for the year. Now, I guess you might say, oh, hang on, doesn't that mean that the economy is declining, that this is a negative number? Well, actually, it's not, because the remarkable thing about the economy, about the labour market, reflects what you said previously about the booming population. We've had this remarkable increase in our population migration this year, and we continue to absorb these hundreds of thousands of new job entrants and continue to reflect a lower unemployment rate. So the higher unemployment rate really reflects the participation rate, which is still at a record low. It's just that we're bringing so many people in, Michael, and we're struggling to find jobs for all of them, but we have this record participation rate. So what I'm saying is, The workforce is exploding, and we're still recording a near record unemployment rate. And that's why we also saw the number of unemployed rising, because so many more people are now in the workforce. Obviously, that they're not all finding jobs. But the latest data showed that we created another 61,000 jobs over the month, Michael. This is just remarkable stuff. We've seen it most months of the year, these big numbers of jobs being created, and recently some higher numbers of unemployed. But again, the participation rate has scorched to another record, 67.2%. So we need to contextualise that higher unemployment rate in the context of a massive influx of workers now in our workforce. So it's still pretty good news that we're being able to absorb record numbers of new workers and maintain a 3% something unemployment rate. So it's still a very strong economy. And I think that those that looked at the numbers carefully were not naysaying the fact that we had our highest unemployment rate for a while. It does say a lot about the Australian economy that we can have record population growth through migration, record participation rate, obviously, as those workers move into the workforce or those migrants work into the workforce, and still record a very, very low unemployment rate.
Our unemployment rates, the Reserve Bank's trying to raise a bit. It's trying to slow down our economy. It's trying to quell inflation. One of the factors causing inflation that you talk about a lot is the price of oil. We don't have control of that, but it seems to be controlling what's happening with our inflation rate.
Yeah, 100%, Michael. We've seen a consistent fall in oil now, really since the middle of the year. We're now, some weeks or some days, we're now seeing the price of a barrel of oil below $70 US. And we compare that to the $124 that we had at the peak last year. Really, at the end of the day, Michael, our improvement in inflation is tracking the improvement in the price of oil. So all the initiatives that are there looking at the bits and pieces of inflation and how it's falling and its relationship to higher interest rates, we just have to look at the track for oil, and it basically is the same track as our inflation rate. So where goes oil? There goes our inflation rate. So notwithstanding what's happening with interest rates. But yes, the price of oil has consistently fallen from the middle of the year, and basically we've seen the underlying position on inflation also falling. So fingers crossed that will continue.
Recently, governments talked about lowering the levels of migration because there seems to be a lot of backlash. People are complaining that migrants are pushing up property values. I'm not sure that's true, taking our jobs. But a lot of the migrants that have come in recently have really been on temporary visas, educational visas, students. The latest ABS figures showed what happened for the year to June. Maybe you'd like to explain how you interpret them.
Well, again, Michael, no surprise. This is the latest data. It's just hot off the press. It's the year to June data, so it's the financial year. Shows another big lift. We've already spoken about that in migration. Net migration is very strong. Victoria leading the charge, followed by New South Wales. We had 152,000 plus new migrants or net migrants into Victoria over the financial year. 140,000 net into New South Wales, and Queensland really still strong at 116,000 net migration over the 23 financial year. I think it's interesting when we look at the breakdown, and of course we're seeing a knee-jerk reaction from the government. We are moving into the electoral cycle, Michael, so policies are reflecting some perhaps nervousness from the government, who's not doing very well in the polls at the moment. So we have seen a number of, I guess, housing market focused policy initiatives over the past week. And one of them, as you mentioned, is in relation to migration. But something I want to point out in relation to the migration numbers is that the surge in temporary visas, which of course are students, has been a significant driver of net migration. And the government's policies, as announced, are targeting temporary migrants, the students and tourists, particularly students. So they're going to tighten that up, as well as temporary visas for tourists, to bring down the total number. And they're going to be a little bit more direct in terms of the skills matching for permanent migrants. But permanent migration will still be reasonably high. But I want to point out that all this fuss about the temporary visas for students is missing the point that, yes, we've got record numbers, net migration of students coming in. But one of the factors behind that is because there's no outflow, Michael, because we haven't had any coming in for years. So the net is basically all positive and no negative, if you understand.
And
I
this
can't
would have
think.
eventually eased itself over the next couple of years
That's right.
without a change of policy.
That's right. So it's once again, this is just a government that looks to be running scared. Obviously, as I said, it's having issues with its performance in terms of the polls, all the usual gobbledygooks coming out from those that are blaming high migration for all our ills. But again, the net high levels of net migration for students is because nobody's leaving, because nobody came in for years. So they haven't completed their qualifications and have left. And as you said, that will adjust itself going forward. So once again, it concerns me that we have these sort of knee-jerk reactions in relation to policy. And yes, look, perhaps there needs to be a more careful balancing in the shorter term going forward. But the problems in terms of housing market and migration aren't really on the demand side, Michael. It's about supply.
Well, that's true, Andrew. As of June 30th this year, our population was 26.6 million people. It increased, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, by 624,100 people over the year. But it's hard to fathom those numbers. If you put it in perspective, we've added a bit like 1.5 Canberras to our population, with the need for accommodation, for services, for infrastructure, for schools. And this is at a time when construction of new dwellings is slumping. We're really getting a housing shortage, as you say, Andrew, because we're not producing the supply.
That's right, Michael. And look, blaming migration for, firstly, I'm not sure we're seeing all this demand certainly in the shorter term from permanent migrants purchasing properties. I think they'd have other alternative. And the other point, Michael, is we know that strong demand from students comes in those particularly inner city suburban apartment markets, which is the favoured target for students, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, but we're not seeing any significant change in vacancy rates over the last month or so for apartments in inner suburban areas. So once again, to me, it's a bit of a thought bubble from the government trying to look at fixing a problem which really is systemic and has been generated for years and years now, perhaps decades, through just mismanagement of housing policy, And I think that mismanagement was reflected again last week when we had a policy announcement from the government in regard to changing the taxes on international developers, which I thought was just swapping the deck chairs on the Titanic to some degree, because they're saying, okay, we're going to charge international developers more, and the money that we get from them, we're going to give to rent to build or build to rent propositions, which again, we're only talking perhaps tens of thousands at the most of new dwellings as a result of build to rent. But there are so many questions. Firstly, well, you're providing a disincentive for international developers, so perhaps there'll be fewer international developments to try to get more rent to build developments. Now, the problem with that build to rent is that these are obviously the government won't be able to resist making some demands on the type of developments that build to rent come out with. Middle level professionals is usually the target, affordable rentals, whatever that means, all the so-called experts and boffins that the government listens to. And they're the ones that, of course, have been so wrong over the last year or last decades in regard to housing policy, will demand some particular type of structure of dwelling in return for the support for build to rent. And of course, that means that we're going to get a sort of a non-market outcome from the build to rent lobby, and we're offsetting what would be normally a market-driven outcome from international developers. So again, we're trying to manipulate markets, and usually, and the lessons have been recently that these attempts by governments, the law of unintended consequences, tend to make things worse and create these pockets of disadvantage even more in terms of what's happening in the rental market. But as I said, we're in the electoral cycle now, and these policies are designed to, I guess, ease concerns from voters that are really doing it tough, particularly tenants.
Yes. Now, we talked a bit about immigration pushing up our population growth, but the other factor is interstate migration, Andrew, people moving from one state to the other. And this chart of yours suggests that Queensland has really been the recipient of people coming from, well, interestingly, particularly New South Wales, but also a little bit from Victoria.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. And we're seeing the COVID issues now starting to ease. Loss of migrants, interstate migrants out of Victoria it's just about back to level. Of course, during the COVID lockdowns, Victorians just fled that jurisdiction, particularly for southeast Queensland. Still some quite positive results coming into southeast Queensland, but I guess that COVID refugee factor is now no longer obviously driven by those severe Victorian lockdowns and the lockdowns in New South Wales as well. But we're still seeing strong growth in Queensland as well. So, and that's being reflected in housing market activity, in rents and prices in southeast Queensland generally.
I just wanted to remind you that this is not specific investment advice because we don't know your personal circumstances, but we're more than happy to have a chat to help you take advantage of this new property cycle. If you think about it, the opportunity like this to get set at the beginning of a new property cycle doesn't happen very often. So why not have an obligation-free chat with my team at Metropole to discuss your goals and to discuss your options. We're much more than just another buyer's agent. We help you safely create intergenerational wealth through property. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. And as we don't sell any properties, our advice is independent and unbiased. Now remember, property investment's a process. It's not an event. So you can't just go out and buy any property and hope to be successful. In fact, now more than ever, getting the right advice is critical. So if you're looking to invest in property or buy a new home, go to metropole.com.au and have a chat with our multi-award winning team. It's a great feeling having the team at Metropole on your side, levelling the playing field. Now, each week we also talk about the auction markets. We discuss a lot of data, but we like seeing what's happening on the ground each weekend because it gives us a real sort of in-time inkling of buyer and seller confidence, and I guess also the depth of the market. And we've finished off our auction markets for the year now, so maybe you'd like to give us a bit of a summary of how the last weekend went and what that means for the year ahead.
So yes, it was the end of the season, Michael. It's I think we could overall say it's been a strong year for our auction markets. Certainly built momentum through the beginning of the year. And then we had those remarkable 80% clearance rates in Sydney and Melbourne through late autumn and into June. Really held up quite well in the 70s, those clearance rates through spring, and then typically ease as we see later in the year. And of course, that easing is a lot to do with what were very strong listing numbers, and we had a similar result last weekend. So last weekend was the last weekend for the 2023 auction market. Again, some generally solid clearance rates despite it being the last day. But of course, again, we had high end of year listings, and we have a pause now for around 6 or 7 weeks, Michael, before the markets ramp up again. Probably the last week in January, first week in February, before we get a real track of what's happening in weekend auction markets. And as we've, I guess, proven once again this year, they're a very positive forward indicator of what's happening generally with our housing markets. It's another big weekend of auctions in Sydney to finish the year, Michael. 848 auctions in Sydney. Down a little bit on the weekend before, but considering we're a week away from Christmas, these are very big numbers of auctions. And really, the Sydney market didn't miss a beat. 66.2% clearance rate, which is just a little bit down on the previous weekend of 66.9%, and ahead of the same weekend last year, Michael, where we had a 61.4%, and about 100 more auctions we had in Sydney this weekend compared to the same weekend last year. Melbourne, again, over 1,000 auctions, 1,006 auctions on the weekend. Again, a very solid clearance rate, given it was the end of the year, 64.7%, which was higher than the previous weekend's 61.5%, and again higher than the same weekend last year. And auction numbers also well ahead of the same weekend last year when there were just under 800 auctions. So a big weekend to finish the year in Sydney and Melbourne, Michael. Brisbane down a little bit with its clearance rates, even though 90 auctions is certainly a lot of auctions for the Brisbane market on a end of year weekend, 35.5% clearance rate, but that clearance rate tends to bounce around a little bit. Adelaide's been under the mark in recent weeks, Michael. We've been used to calling 80% clearance rates in Adelaide for most of the year. It had a 69% clearance rate from, again, another big weekend of auctions, 118. Canberra, auctions down on the previous weekend, 55 auctions in Canberra, 58% clearance rate in Canberra, but it was well down on that clearance rate for the same weekend last year. So I think overall positive results, Michael. And when we look at the trend for the full year, we can certainly see that even though auction action has eased in terms of clearance rates through the spring market, it's still maintained what is quite positive results for sellers, tracking around about 70% in both Melbourne and Sydney. But when we look at the number of sales that are actually being conducted compared to earlier in the year when we did have those 80% clearance rates, sales are very high at the moment. So even though clearance rates are a little lower, we're getting plenty of turnover in our auction markets, particularly Melbourne and Sydney. And I think that portends well for next year, Michael. We always tend to start the year off where we finish, and I think that will certainly be a market still just in favour of sellers to begin 2024.
I look forward to our next chat, Andrew, where we actually have a look at the year that was and the year ahead, and also your forecast for 2024. So we'll catch up real soon before the end of the year for our last Property Insider chat for the year.
Yeah, thanks, Michael.